They said she was crazy. Not behind her back, to her face, at the feed store counter, at the diner on Route 9, in the parking lot of the First Baptist Church where her late husband used to usher on Sunday mornings. They said it with their coffee cups halfway to their mouths, and their eyes doing that thing eyes do when pity and contempt share the same expression. 800 turkeys, on 43 acres of high desert scrubland that couldn't grow a decent tomato. In a county where the last turkey operation folded in 1987, and the man who ran it still wouldn't talk about it. She heard every word. She wrote some of them down. I know because I was there, not at the beginning, when Nora Vasquez first strung the wire and laid the water lines and drove the stakes into ground so dry it cracked like old porcelain. I came later, when the sky turned wrong and the sound started, that low, papery rustle that anyone who's lived on the Colorado Plateau long enough knows means something biblical is coming. I was a county agricultural extension agent 7 months into my first posting, 26 years old, carrying a clipboard I didn't know how to fill out yet, driving a truck the state had assigned me that still smelled like the last guy's cigarettes. I showed up to Nora's farm to deliver bad news. I stayed because what happened there didn't have a form I could file. This is what I wrote in my personal log, the one I keep in a green notebook that I've never shown my supervisor, starting the morning the grasshoppers came. The first thing I noticed about Nora Vasquez was her hands. Not her face, which was angular and sun-darkened and gave away nothing, and not her voice, which came out of her like something measured and poured rather than simply spoken. Her hands. They moved the way hands move when they've worked so long at a single purpose that the work has become physiological, fingers curling around a fence post before she'd even fully looked at it, thumb testing the tension of a wire with the unconscious authority of a musician checking a string. She was 51 years old and had been farming this specific piece of mesa-edge land for 11 years, and her hands were the 11 years made visible. I pulled up in the state truck at 6:40 in the morning, which I thought was respectably early. She'd already been working for 2 hours. "Extension office," I said, climbing out, holding up my badge like it meant something. "Vasquez Farm." She looked at the badge, then at me, then back at the badge. "That's a new photo," she said. "You look about 12. "I'm 26. That's what I said. She didn't smile when she said it, but something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite amusement, more like a notation. She went back to what she was doing, which was examining a section of fencing along the eastern perimeter with the focus of someone reading a document that didn't add up. I followed her because I didn't know what else to do. The turkeys were, I want to say, everywhere, but that's not accurate. They were organized. I hadn't expected that. I'd grown up near a commercial poultry operation, and my memory of those birds was of undifferentiated mass, feathers and noise and ammonia, the particular blankness of creatures that had been reduced to units. Nora's birds were something else. They moved in loose congregations across the scrubland, picking through the sparse desert grasses, their heads tilting with what seemed, against all ornithological reason, like curiosity. The land was divided into rotating sections with portable electric fencing, 6 sections. I'd learn, each resting in sequence so the forage could recover. She was running 800 birds on a management system I'd never seen in any of my coursework. "The grasshopper pressure is going to be significant this season," I said, because that was why I was there. The county had sent warnings the week before. Melanoplus spreadus, Rocky Mountain locust, was expected in numbers not seen in the region since the 1930s. I had maps. I had projections. I had a packet of information about pesticide application windows and mitigation strategies that I was supposed to distribute to every agricultural operation in my district. Nora took the packet. She looked at it. She handed it back. "I know," she said. "You know about the projections. I've been watching the cracks in the soil since February. When the moisture gets low in that particular way and the winter was warm enough at depth," she stopped, looked at me, decided something. "Never mind. What does the county want me to do?" "There's a coordinated spray schedule being organized. Most operations in the district are participating. Given the size of your flock," I paused, trying to remember the right language from my training. "The grasshoppers will be in your forage areas, could cause significant." "They'll come through everything," she said. "Yes. The spray program would kill everything the grasshoppers don't. You understand that, right?" She said it without heat, just laying a fact on the table. The chemical protocol they're recommending doesn't distinguish. 6 weeks of restricted grazing after application. I can't hold 800 birds in confinement for 6 weeks. Not without the kind of infrastructure I don't have. Not without the feed costs that would put me under before the restriction lifted. She looked at me steadily. Did whoever put that packet together account for that? I thought about the packet. I thought about the meeting where it had been assembled, the county agricultural committee, the chemical company representative who'd driven up from Albuquerque, the maps I'd helped collate. I don't think that scenario was specifically addressed. No. She reached out and took the fence wire in her fingers again, testing it. Thank you for coming out. It was a dismissal delivered without rudeness, which somehow made it worse. I stood there for a moment with my clipboard and my truck keys, watching her move along the fence line. What are you going to do? I asked. She turned around and looked at me, and for a moment the measure went out of her face and something more unguarded moved through it. Not fear exactly, but an awareness of the size of what was coming that she'd been keeping carefully behind her eyes. It lasted only a second. Then the measure came back. I'm going to let them eat, she said. I didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. I drove back out to Nora's farm 3 times in the next 2 weeks, which was more than my caseload technically required. I told myself it was diligence. In my green notebook I wrote, something here that I don't know how to categorize yet, using farm visit in the file. The second visit I brought her the updated projections, which had worsened. The infestation belt was tracking northeast, which meant Canyon Largo County was directly in its path. Several operations had already preemptively sold off stock. The Delacroix brothers, who ran the biggest cattle operation in the county, had gotten out of their summer pasture lease early and moved their herd south. A man named Garrett Foss, who farmed pinto beans on 200 acres along the river bottom, had started the spray schedule early on his own before the coordinated effort, which the Extension Office was trying to diplomatically address because he hadn't filed the required applications. And Nora Vasquez was moving her turkeys. That was what she was doing when I arrived, repositioning the portable fencing to open up 2 sections simultaneously, which went against the rotation logic she'd explained to me on my first visit. The birds were fanning out across the newly opened ground, that same purposeful, tilting movement, working the soil surface with a systematic intensity that I now recognized as feeding behavior rather than aimless wandering. You're opening more ground, I said. Loading it up. She was driving a stake with a rubber mallet, steady, economical strokes. Whatever forage is out there, I want it worked through before the hatch. The hatch is 6 to 10 days, depending on the heat. She stopped and looked at the sky, which was high and pale and cloudless in the way that Mesa Country gets in late June, that particular shade of blue that looks more like glass than atmosphere. It'll stay hot. I stood with my clipboard, Mrs. Vasquez. Nora, the projections are worse. The density models now suggest you could be looking at densities of 50 to 100 insects per square yard across. I know. 50 to 100 per square yard is approximately what I need, she said, and went back to driving the stake. I wrote in my notebook that night, she said, approximately what I need. I keep turning that over. I'm missing something fundamental. The third visit, a neighbor was there. His name was Calvin Prout, and he farmed alfalfa on the section adjacent to Nora's eastern border. He was 60-something, with a face like weathered sandstone, and an opinion he was delivering at volume when I pulled up. I could hear it through my truck window before I rolled it down. Not just your problem when those birds can't function because the insects are carrying. He stopped when he saw me get out of the truck. Extension Office. Good. Talk some sense into her. Good morning, I said. She's going to lose every bird she's got, and then she's going to want to talk to the county about some kind of. Calvin, Nora's voice was quiet. That was the thing about how she spoke. It was quiet, and it landed anyway. He's not here to referee. I'm here with updated resource information, I said, which wasn't entirely true. Calvin turned back to Nora. He had the look of a man who'd been having a version of this argument for years and was tired but couldn't let it go. You've got the whole thing wrong, he said. Always have. This land doesn't support what you're trying to do. Never did. Harlan knew it. He stopped himself. Something crossed his face that might have been regret at the last sentence. Harlan had been her husband. I'd learned that from the county records. Harlan Vasquez died 4 years ago. The farm had been in his family, not hers. She'd married into it, and into the high desert from somewhere in the Rio Grande Valley. After he died, the prevailing local wisdom had been that she'd sell and go back south. She hadn't. Nora looked at Calvin for a long moment. Her hands were still. Harlan knew it might not work, she said. He tried it anyway, so did I, so am I. Calvin made a sound that was somewhere between a scoff and a sigh. He got in his truck and drove away, leaving a rooster tail of dust over the hardpan. I looked at Nora. She was watching the dust settle with an expression I couldn't read. Then she turned and went back to her fence-line, and I followed, because by now following seemed like the only appropriate response I had. He's not wrong that it's risky, I said, because I'd decided that honesty was more useful than diplomatic information packets. No, she agreed. He's wrong that it's stupid. Those aren't the same thing. I wrote that down in my notebook when I got back to the truck. I wrote it down, and then I sat there for 20 minutes looking at the farm through my windshield. The orderly patchwork sections, the birds moving through the scrubland, the woman checking a water line with her particular way of making every motion count. And I thought about risk and stupidity and the difference between them, and I didn't come up with anything good enough to write down next to it. I was back on day 7. Not for professional reasons. I told myself it was professional. I showed up at 5:30 in the morning because that's when I figured she'd be up, and she was, standing at the edge of the mesa where the land dropped away into the canyon system, looking east. She had a cup of coffee in her hand. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "You should look at this," she said, not turning around. I came and stood beside her and looked east. The dawn light was coming up pink and gold over the canyon rim, and at first that's all I saw, the light, the layers of sandstone in their bands of ochre and sienna, the scrub juniper clinging to the ledges. Then I heard it. A sound like paper, like 1,000 sheets of paper rustling in a wind that wasn't there. It was coming from the east, from beyond the canyon rim, from out over the flat pan of the desert where the heat already shimmered even at this hour. It was low, and it was constant, and it had a quality that I recognized before my mind put a name to it, the quality of something enormous, moving. "How far?" I asked. "Moving fast with the wind this afternoon." She sipped her coffee. "Maybe before." I stood there listening to that distant paper sound and felt something that my training had not prepared me for, which was the specific fear of something so large it has its own acoustic signature. I thought about the maps in my office, the projected density figures, the spray schedule that most of the county was now committed to. I thought about 800 turkeys and 43 acres of high desert scrubland. "You should have some options," I said. "There might be." "Sit down," she said. "What?" "You've been standing like that every time you come out here, all tense through the shoulders." She sat down herself, right on the ground on the edge of the mesa, legs crossed, coffee cup on her knee. "Sit down." I sat down. We sat there together in the early light and listened to the grasshoppers coming. She was completely still. I was gripping my knees and trying to look like I wasn't. A turkey wandered over from behind us and stood about 3 feet away, head tilted, watching the eastern horizon with what I can only describe as professional interest. "It'll be what it is," Nora said. She wasn't talking to me exactly. She was making a statement of fact to the morning. "We've done the preparation. We've done the preparation." She said it twice, the second time slower, like she was making sure she believed it. Across the county, the spray planes were being loaded. On Nora Vasquez's 43 acres, 800 turkeys waited on ground that had been deliberately, methodically, opened to them, worked and foraged and readied for something that the county's mitigation plans had not thought to account for. The sound from the east grew. In my green notebook I wrote, 6:12 a.m. the grasshoppers are coming. She said, "We've done the preparation." I am beginning to understand what she means, I think. I looked at the turkey that was still standing next to us, still watching the horizon. It blinked once slowly. I envied it the certainty. They hit at 11:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was still there, sitting in my truck at the edge of the property, ostensibly filing reports on my county tablet, actually unable to make myself leave, and I wrote it down the moment I heard the sound change from a distant rustling to something that had weight and direction, like a weather system, like the air pressure dropping all at once. Nora was in the middle section when they came. She'd brought all 6 portable fencing sections to their most open configuration, which now made the whole 43 acres one continuous space, the rotation system abandoned in favor of maximum spread. 800 turkeys across 43 acres of mesa scrubland, and then the sky darkened in a strip along the eastern horizon, not the way a storm darkens it gradually with a smooth progression. This was more abrupt than that, more mechanical, a line between one state of the world and another, and it was moving west at the speed of the wind, which that morning was running about 15 miles an hour out of the southeast. I stepped out of the truck. I stood on the running board to see better. The grasshoppers came in a density I don't have a good comparison for. I've tried in the report I eventually filed and in my green notebook to find language that communicates it accurately. The closest I've gotten is this. Imagine the air becoming a solid, and then imagine the solid landing. They covered the fence posts. They covered the truck hood. They covered the scrubland in a seething carpet that appeared to move as a single organism, a single terrible will, consuming the forage grasses and the sage, and the dry forbs with a sound that was not the dramatic roar I might have expected, but something quieter and more relentless. A mass intake, a collective reduction, the grassland being processed. And then the turkeys moved. I don't know what I'd expected. I don't think I'd thought far enough ahead to expect anything specific. But what I watched over the next 4 hours rewrote most of what I thought I understood about the relationship between farming and nature, between management and wildness, between a plan and the living world that plans attempt to navigate. The turkeys fed. That sounds simple. That sounds like one sentence. It was not one sentence. It was 800 individual animals, each operating on instincts that had been selected for over millions of years of evolutionary coexistence with exactly this kind of abundance, moving through the incoming grasshopper mass with an efficiency that was, I need to say this plainly, extraordinary. They spread out automatically without apparent coordination into patterns that maximized coverage. They did not panic. They did not crowd each other. They did not flee. They moved through the insects the way a river moves through a landscape, finding the path of most resource, shifting when the density shifted, covering and recovering ground. Nora was in the middle of it. That's the thing I want to get right, because I think it's the thing that most determines what this story actually is. She was in the middle of the infestation, in the middle of the field, not watching from the edge the way I was watching. She had a bucket. She was monitoring the eastern section's water supply, which the grasshoppers had found and were crowding, and she was moving them away from the water access points with a calm, continuous, utterly unspectacular labor that had nothing heroic in its surface appearance, and was, I think, the bravest thing I have ever seen a person do. She was covered in them, that's what I mean. The grasshoppers didn't avoid her. They moved over her boots, her jeans, her jacket, and she let them, because managing them off would have taken energy and attention she needed elsewhere. She moved through the infestation like it was simply a medium she was working in, the way a sculptor works in clay, taking the material as given and applying will and attention to what could be shaped. I got out of the truck. I want to be honest about what took me so long, which is that I was frightened, in a way that I found embarrassing then and find only slightly less embarrassing now. Not of the grasshoppers exactly. They weren't dangerous in any immediate physical sense, but of the scale, of the sound, of the way the ordinary landscape had become something from a different order of experience and the disorientation that came from that. I put on my jacket, I rolled up my collar, I walked into the field. She didn't look up when I arrived beside her, but she shifted the bucket to give me a place to walk without interfering with her path. "You came back," she said. "I never left," I said. A pause. "I know, I saw the truck." Another pause. "Take the south water point. There are 2, something's gotten into one of the lines. You'll see it." "What do I do if—" "Look at it first," she said. "Then we'll see." I went south. The water line blockage turned out to be an accumulation of insects in the float valve housing. They'd found the moisture and crowded it until the valve jammed in the closed position. I stared at it for probably longer than I should have before I understood the mechanics of what I was looking at. And then I spent 15 minutes clearing it with a stick and my fingers, and an acute awareness that I had not been trained for any of this. The turkeys watched me work with their head-tilting interest. One of them stood directly behind me for the entire process, close enough that I could feel the occasional brush of feathers against the back of my jacket. "You're not helpful," I told it. It tilted its head the other way. When I got the valve cleared and the water flowing again, I stood up and looked out across the field. The scope of what was happening had not diminished. If anything, the grasshopper density seemed to be still increasing, the incoming wave having not fully arrived, but something had changed in my perception of it. I could see the system. Not perfectly, not comprehensively, but I could see the outline of what Nora had designed. The open space, the distributed water points, the absence of barriers that would crowd the birds into panic. The turkeys were not being managed through the infestation. They were managing through it themselves, and what Nora had done was create the conditions for that to be possible. It was not a guarantee. That was the thing she'd said on the mesa at dawn. It'll be what it is. She'd prepared, but preparation is not the same as control, and she knew that better than I did. I went back and found her. She was at the northeast corner, watching a group of about 30 turkeys work through a particularly dense concentration of grasshoppers. Her face had the focused, assessing quality I'd seen on my first visit, the same face she'd used on the fence, but there was something additional in it now. Something I recognized only because I'd seen it once before, on my first farm visit when she'd looked at the scale of what was coming, and then put it back behind her eyes. She was afraid. Not performing fear, not giving into it, but carrying it, the way you carry something heavy on a long walk, not by pretending it isn't heavy, but by adjusting your gait to compensate. She was afraid that it wouldn't be enough, that the preparation wouldn't hold, that the thing she'd staked everything on, her understanding of these birds, this land, this particular confluence of conditions, would turn out to be insufficient against something as vast and indifferent as an infestation of this scale. She was afraid, and she was working, and she was not letting the fear make the decisions. "How are the numbers?" I asked, because it seemed like the useful question. She didn't answer immediately. I thought she hadn't heard me over the feeding noise. That constant, relentless rustling had become a kind of ambient wall of sound. But then she said, "What I expected, maybe a little under." "Is that good?" "Could be better, could be." She watched the 30 birds in the corner. "The north section is doing the most work. I need to redirect some from the center when I can do it without disrupting the feeding momentum." "How do you redirect?" "Slowly, very slowly. They're not dogs, you don't call them." She looked at me sideways. "You move the feed." "Where's the feed?" She looked at me with an expression that I initially read as impatience and then revised to something closer to consideration, the look of someone deciding whether an unfamiliar tool might be useful. "Shed," she said. "Behind the main structure, blue bins." I carried feed that afternoon. That was my contribution to the project that Nora Vasquez had designed and executed on instincts and knowledge and 11 years of specific attention to a specific piece of land. I carried blue bins of supplemental feed to the north section, and I did it slowly, and I did it without drama, and the turkeys followed the feed the way Nora said they would, not eagerly, not in a rush, but with the pragmatic interest of animals that understood the relationship between effort and resource. At 3 in the afternoon, Calvin Prout came back. He drove up to the fence line in his truck and got out and stood looking at the field for a long time. He had an expression I didn't know what to do with. I came over to the fence. "How's his alfalfa?" Nora said, not looking up from what she was doing. "I don't know," I said. "I didn't ask." "Ask." I went to the fence. Calvin and I stood on opposite sides of it. He was watching the turkeys work the field, which was still covered in a density of grasshoppers that remained extraordinary, but now, and this was something I could see from the inside that you couldn't see from the road, diminishing. Not gone, not controlled, but the carpet was thinner in the sections the birds had been working longest, and the feeding was still going, and the math of it was beginning to declare itself. "Your alfalfa?" I asked. He looked at me, he looked at the field. "Gone," he said, not angry, just flat. 2 hours, I had 40 acres of first cut ready to take, and it's gone, stripped." He was quiet for a moment. "I did the spray schedule. I did everything right." He said the last part with a particular quality, not accusation, but an exhausted bewilderment, the sound of a man who had followed all the rules and encountered a situation that the rules hadn't been written for. I didn't know what to say. He looked at Nora, who was 60 yards away with her bucket, not looking at us. "She knew," he said. "She thought she knew," I said, which was the honest version. "That's the same thing," he said, "when it works out." He He got back in his truck. He sat in it for a while without driving anywhere. Then he pulled out and went back down the road, leaving his dust hanging in the hot afternoon air. I wrote it all down that night, all of it. The sound and the density and the valve and the blue feed bins and the 30 turkeys in the northeast corner and Calvin Prout's face at the fence and what he said about knowing and working out. I wrote it down in the green notebook without stopping, sitting in my truck in Nora's drive at 9:30 at night. And when I finally looked up, the light was still on in the farmhouse, and the night was very quiet, and if I listened carefully, the rustle was still there, fainter, but still there, like the sound of something being processed into something else. In the morning, I would drive the county roads and see what was left. I wasn't ready for that yet. What was left? I need to find the right way to begin that, because beginning it wrong would be a kind of dishonesty about what those days actually were. So, what was left, when the main infestation front passed through Canyon Largo County over a period of 4 days and moved on northwest, was an accounting that the County Agricultural Committee would eventually formalize in a report that I helped write, and that managed, through the bureaucratic alchemy of formal language, to be entirely accurate and entirely inadequate at the same time. The numbers, 63% of participating farms in the county, reported significant to total crop loss. The Garrett Foss operation, the one that had spray scheduled early without filing, reported the complete loss of his pinto bean crop despite the chemical application, because the spray window had been miscalculated relative to the hatch timing, and he'd also lost 6 weeks of grazing access on his remaining acreage due to the residue protocols. 3 cattle operations reported significant weight loss in their herds due to the sudden absence of pasture forage. The Delacroix brothers, who'd moved their herds south early, had avoided the worst, but the cost of the early move and the least pasture in the south put them operationally thin going into fall. And one farm in the county reported no crop loss, no stock loss, and a measurable reduction in grasshopper density across its acreage compared to adjacent properties. Nora Vasquez's farm. I drove the county roads on the 5th morning after the main front passed. I do this sometimes when I need to think. I have a route I go, not for any official purpose, just to look at the land and let the looking do something to whatever I'm trying to work through. The route goes past the Foss place, past the Delacroix summer pasture, past the long fence line of the Martin family grain operation, and eventually out to the Mesa Road that runs along the eastern edge of Nora's property. I drove slowly. The Foss place looked like the description of aftermath, the field stubble reduced to nothing, the soil exposed and cracked, the remaining plants at the irrigation margin stripped to their structural stems. There is a specific ugliness to land that has been consumed rather than harvested, something in the randomness of the loss that is different from the clean brutality of a machine. The Delacroix pasture, the Martin grain fields, every place the same in its particular version. And then the Mesa Road and Nora's eastern fence line. The contrast was, I want to give you the honest version of this, which is that it wasn't dramatic the way contrast can be in stories. It wasn't a hard line between devastation and paradise. The grasshoppers had been there on her land too, I'd stood in the middle of them, I knew, but the forage loss was different, not absent, different. The scrubland grasses were grazed down but not gone. Some sections were more depleted than others, corresponding to the sections the birds had spent the most time in. The sage was touched but standing. The soil surface had that disturbed, worked quality that comes from intensive foraging, but you could see the crowns of the grass plants still in the ground, and grass crowns mean regrowth, and regrowth means the system wasn't broken. 800 turkeys, alive and apparently healthy, moved through the surviving vegetation in their purposeful, tilting way. I pulled over and got out and leaned on the fence for a long time. I should tell you what I heard in town before I went back out to the farm. I stopped at the diner on Route 9 for coffee, the same diner where I'd been told people had said things about Nora Vasquez and her turkeys over the years, across those same tables with those same looks. It was morning, the breakfast rush, and the counter was full. I sat at the end and ordered coffee and listened without making it obvious I was listening. The conversation going around the counter was about what had happened. Of course it was. Everyone in the county was processing it. Most of the conversation was about the losses, the specific losses, the individual calculations, the insurance questions, The how do we recover logistics that farming communities engage in after disasters with the same exhausted practicality as any other kind of survival. And then someone at the middle of the counter said Nora Vasquez's name. I didn't look up. There was a pause in the conversation, not a dramatic pause, just the pause that happens when a name enters a room that carries some history with it. She made out, someone said, a man's voice. I didn't know him. Turkeys, someone else said, like that explained everything. Maybe it did. She knew what she was doing, a third voice said. And here is the thing I want to get right about what followed. Nobody said we always knew she would be fine. Nobody performed retroactive respect in that clean, invented way that stories sometimes tell it, where the community that doubted comes around in one graceful acknowledgement. What happened instead was that the conversation moved on, the way conversations do, to the specific mechanics of the Foss situation and the county relief application deadline. And Nora Vasquez's name was not attached to admiration or apology or anything that resolving it as a story might require. It was just spoken, noted, and passed. Which is to say, some things don't resolve neatly, but they are noted. She was at the fence line when I got there. Of course she was. She was checking the temporary fencing, beginning the process of restoring the rotation sections now that the main infestation had passed. The same work, the same hands, the same methodical economy of motion. The turkeys were distributed across the southern sections in their loose congregations. One of them, a large tom I'd started to recognize by a scar along his wattle, was following her along the fence line at about 8 feet of distance, which she appeared to have accepted as a fixed condition of the work. You should come to the county meeting next week, I said by way of greeting. She looked up. What meeting? The Agricultural Committee is doing a post-event review. The spray protocol, the mitigation strategies. They want to, I paused. They want to understand what worked and what didn't. What didn't work is most of it, she said. Yes, I paused, which is why you should come. She went back to the fence. The scarred tom adjusted his distance to maintain the 8 feet. I watched her work the wire. They'll want a formal report, she said. They'll want data. You have data, 11 years of it. 11 years of watching one piece of land in one set of conditions. She paused on the wire, not looking at me. That's not the kind of data that travels well. Maybe not, but it's the kind that built the only thing standing in this county right now, so I stopped myself, took a breath. I'm not asking you to write a paper. I'm asking you to sit in a room and tell them what you did and why you did it. A long pause. The wind came across the mesa, warm and dry, carrying the smell of scrubland and that faint undertone of something composted, the grasshopper residue already beginning its return to soil chemistry. The turkeys moved through it without comment. Harlan used to say that, she said, that the land-specific knowledge doesn't travel. She was quiet for a moment. He was right about most things. Was he right about that? She thought about it. Actually thought about it, standing still, hands on the wire, in the way she had of giving questions the weight they required rather than answering them efficiently. I think he was right that it doesn't travel easily, she said finally. I think he was maybe wrong that it doesn't travel at all. She let the wire go. What time is the meeting? She asked. I want to tell you about the meeting, but maybe not in the way you're expecting. She came. She sat in the folding chair I'd saved for her near the back of the extension office's meeting room, which smelled like decades of coffee and had maps on every wall that I'd helped hang. The County Agricultural Committee was there, 7 people, most of whom I now knew well enough to know that some of them had their minds already settled and were going through the motions of review, and some of them genuinely didn't understand what had happened and wanted to. Calvin Prout was there. He'd been a committee member for years. I hadn't known that, sitting at the end of the table with his hands flat on it. The committee chair opened with the preliminary findings, loss figures, insurance implications, the question of whether the coordinated spray protocol should be restructured or abandoned. Standard assessment language, the kind that takes something vast and living and reduces it to columns. Then he got to the anomalous outcome. 1 farm, significant infestation, no reportable loss. He said it neutrally, which was the right way to say it in that room. He looked at Nora. She looked back. Would you like to speak to your methodology? He asked. She sat still for a moment. I was watching her from the side. and I saw the thing happen in her face that I'd seen twice before, the inside and outside negotiating. Then she leaned forward in the folding chair, forearms on her knees, and spoke. She didn't perform it. That's what I want you to understand. She didn't rise to the occasion in the cinematic sense, voice steady and clear, all doubt dispatched. She spoke the way she worked, with the particular plainness of someone to whom the work is more interesting than the impression of the work. She talked about the rotation system and the rationale behind it, the soil recovery intervals, the relationship between turkey foraging behavior and insect pressure that she'd observed over years of watching her specific acreage. She talked about the moisture depth conditions in February that had told her what the summer might bring, and how she'd shifted the rotation sequence in response. She made at least 2 mistakes in the technical terminology and corrected herself without apology. Halfway through, Calvin Prout spoke. "Why turkeys," he said, "specifically over other stock?" The room waited. Nora looked at him. There was a history between them in the look, years of it, the things that had been said at fence lines and in parking lots and across the silence of mutual proximity on the high mesa. She held it for a moment, that look. "Harlan wanted turkeys," she said. "I didn't at first. I thought he was wrong. We argued about it." A pause. "He was right." Calvin looked at his hands on the table. Said nothing. "He was right because he'd watched the land. He understood what it would support." She paused. "I understood after he was gone. It took me some time and some embarrassing failures, but I got there." The room was quiet, not the polite quiet of managed meetings, a different kind. The kind that follows the landing of something real. The committee chair asked some technical follow-up questions. Other people spoke. The meeting went on for another 90 minutes, through lunch options and funding and the possibility of a county-level demonstration site, none of which was resolved. Meetings don't resolve things, they move things, which is slower and different. When it ended, Calvin Prout left without speaking to Nora. He was out the door and down the steps before most people had gathered their coats, and I watched him go and thought about the specific weight of that, a man carrying something that hadn't finished composting yet. Sometimes forgiveness is not the right word for what's available. Sometimes what's available is a slower process with the same eventual direction. I went back to the farm one more time before winter. September. The mesa was turning its fall colors, not the dramatic leaf turn of wetter climates, but the more subtle shift of high desert autumn, the scrubland going amber and gold at the edges, the seed heads of the surviving grasses catching the lower angled light. Nora had begun the recovery rotation on the depleted sections, moving the birds off and letting the crowns push new growth in the cooling weather. She had a spreadsheet, not digital, on paper, in a binder, tracking the recovery progress section by section. She showed it to me. It was a document that would mean nothing to most people, a grid of dates and notations and small symbols that represented a private notation system I didn't fully understand. But the direction of it was legible, the movement from loss toward recovery, tracked across weeks in the handwriting of someone who had been paying attention to this specific piece of earth for 11 years and would keep paying attention. "You'll be fine for winter?" I asked. "Fine is probably ambitious," she said. "Functional is functional enough." She looked out over the mesa, the section of land she'd defended through something that most of the county was still calling a catastrophe. The birds moved in their unhurried way through the recovering scrub, the scarred tom somewhere in the southern section, doing whatever it is that scarred toms do in the September afternoon. "Harlan thought so," she said. "Functional is the year that teaches you what fine actually costs." I wrote that down when I got to the truck. I wrote down most of what she said in those visits. I have the green notebook still, 4 of them now, because I kept going back, kept driving out to the Mesa Road when I needed to think, kept filing it professionally as agricultural monitoring visits, and filing it personally as something I don't have a better word for than witness. Witness to the kind of knowing that doesn't travel easily, the kind that grew out of specific soil, specific loss, specific years of getting it wrong before getting it survivably right. I don't know how to put that in a county report. I know how to write the column with her numbers in it, and I do, every season, the one farm in the district that keeps producing data that slightly exceeds the models. Calvin Prout bought turkeys the following spring, 40 birds to start. He didn't tell anyone he was doing it, and he didn't call Nora, and she didn't say anything about it when she saw them from the Mesa Road. But she noticed. She noticed the way she noticed everything about that land, quietly, precisely, without making it mean more than it meant, and without letting it mean less. The grasshoppers came back, smaller in the second year. They come back. This is the condition of the land, the thing that doesn't change. The land gives, and the land takes, and the land gives again, on its own schedule, indifferent to what anyone needs from it. What changes is the knowing. What changes is whether you've paid enough attention over enough seasons to have something to offer back. 800 turkeys. They mocked her for it. And then a plague came through and left only her farm standing. And the county wrote it up in a report that I helped author and that used the word anomalous in 4 different places. Because the forms we have for understanding things like Nora Vasquez are, in the end, forms built for a different kind of knowledge than the one she practiced. She filed the report away in the binder with the recovery spreadsheet. I have the last line of my green notebook entry from that September visit, and I'm going to leave it as it is without explaining it, the way she left most things, as something the land might eventually make clear.